What's going on, guys? Abraxas here. Today we'll talk about the difference between the balanced lists and skewed lists. The balanced lists try to play in every phase and against every opponent, and the skewed lists try to max out one element in the list and see where this leads them. Let's get the fun factor out of the way. I would personally say that the skewed lists are a bit funnier to play, but they can have a high variance of fun, because you can either have very much fun if you're playing against the list that is a good opponent for you, but also you can have a very low amount of fun if you are playing against the list that perfectly counters you, which should not be that rare. So in this video I will mostly talk about the competitive factors for picking whether you want to have more balanced lists or more skewed lists. And while mostly I will talk about single tournaments, I will also talk a bit about team tournaments at the end. So let's start with a very important economical law that has a wide variety of uses in many different fields. So this is the Marginal Utility Law. So what it basically says is that every additional piece of the same product gives you less utility, so you are less satisfied. So for example, if you have no food and you get a dinner, then you are very happy. But if you just ate 3 dinners and your grandma is trying to push into you the 4th one, then it's not so good, is it? So for me, that's the base of the theory for whether you should choose the balanced lists or more skewed lists. Because if you start investing in one phase a lot, then every next point that you invest at some point will be worth if you diversify this into other phases. So if you, for example, bring only shooting list, then the last 500 points you spend on the shooting could be used better in the close combat usually. This is not always the case, and there are exceptions to it, because for example, you might need more and more shooting to make sure that you will kill the one particular unit, and the same goes for magic. But in general, I would say that going for the balanced list is much better. In many books you have the choices that are considered very strong. And the prime example was the Warriors of the Dark Gods, where basically chosen knights were really strong, and practically 2 or 3 units were in each list. And I've seen lists with 5 times, and then I've seen lists with 9 times regular on foot chosen. And I would generally say that I really don't like those lists. With skewed lists like that, we are not really utilizing the synergies you have in your army. You are basically just going for the strongest picks. And while the strong picks are strong, and I think the synergy factor is much higher than what individuals units can bring. So what is the most important thing about it is, when you are picking one unit over and over again, or one type of models over and over again, you are playing a very dangerous rock, paper, scissors game. If you face a list that is an exact counter to your list, or that has a one particular element that you struggle to play against because you didn't bring, for example, magic, then you are pretty much doomed, and the game is uninteresting for both you and your opponent. You will not score high, and you're basically blocking yourself a chance of getting good plays. And if you play against a list that your list is perfectly tailored against, then it's the same way. You are not getting any fun because you are just crushing your opponent. Your opponent is not getting any fun because he is getting crushed. And then while you get a high score, and at some point you are bound to face a list that is perfect counter to you. So what I observe that better players tend to do is that better players tend to bring the lists that are all around us. Because basically, if you are playing an all-arounder list, and if you are playing a random opponent, then your score is much more dependent on your own skill in the game and not the list matchup. I think compared to 8th edition, the rock, paper, scissors effect in the 9th age is much lower, but still you can get really hard counters. If you are playing an army with 9 chosen units of Wrath, then if you face something like Pegasus Lord with multi-wounds from Bretonia, or any basically any Britannia army because they will get a charge off, you can be pretty much screwed. So when picking your list, it is very important for you to understand how good really are you. Because if you are a good player, and if you consider yourself a good player, then you don't need to bring skewed lists to the tournaments. Because you will score high with the more balanced lists, and reducing the risk of hitting the completely bad matchup should be the most important factor for you. And if you are a worse player, then it might be very much worth it for you to bring the skewed lists to the tournament, because that's basically the only way for you to get a very high place. You have to know that you sometimes just have to play your odds. And if you know that you are not going to get a high place with the balanced list, maybe it's better to bring a very one-dimensional list so that you can maybe play against players who you have good matchups against. When I'm playing at the tournaments, while I prefer to bring balanced lists, I know that I struggle most when I'm facing the more skewed lists, because it makes the matchup much more dicier. If I'm playing against another balanced list, I can usually play better than my opponent. I can outplay him and get more points. But if I'm playing against a very skewed list, then 1 or 2 rolls can really turn the game around. And it doesn't really matter if the matchup is very good or very bad. So if you are a good player and you believe in your skills, you should go to the tournaments with the more balanced lists. And if you feel like you have a lot to learn still about the game, about the mechanics, about the tricks in the game, then maybe you should try to bring more skewed lists, because this is probably your best option of getting the highest score at tournaments. The team tournaments are much different for the case that even the biggest win with a good pairing is not as worth as the good result with a bad pairing. So if you are bringing a skewed list to the tournament and half of your matchups are good and half of your matchups are bad, then you are not really playing for the team, because pairing you into the good matchup can sometimes be really hard. And I would say that for the teams of 8, you can afford maybe 1, maybe 2 skewed lists, but the vast majority of the lists should be balanced lists that can be all takers for any opponents. Because I know that I would personally prefer to have 2 matchups that are marked as draws than to have 1 matchup that is marked as a win and 1 matchup that is marked as a loss, because I want to trust in the skill of my teammates. So when you're bringing a balanced list to the team tournament, you are making the pairing phase much easier for your whole team. And if you can take any matchup and get decent points out of it, and by decent I mean 8, 9, maybe sometimes even 7, then it's much better thing than if in the half of the matchups you will make 20 points and in half of the matchups you will make 0. And I would say that for team tournaments, the previous rule that if you are a good team or a strong team, you should bring more balanced lists, doesn't really work, because if you are worse players and you are bringing all skewed lists, you will get tabled on half of the tables, and on the other half, if your opponents are better, then they will get some points out anyways, so you will lose your games either way. So I would not create that distinction in team tournaments, and in team tournaments I would generally say that skewed lists should be rare and should consist of no more than 20% of your team, because otherwise pairing your team will be a nightmare, and always you will find yourself in at least one very bad matchup. So for the summary, I would say that the min-max lists that focus only on one factor or one phase or one unit are usually a bit more interesting. They look much smoother and they can lead to some funny games. But on the other hand, if you are treating this more seriously and you want to play more competitively, you should try to bring more balanced lists that can play in every phase and can play against any opponent. Hope you guys enjoyed this video, and see you in the next one. Cheers!